and welcome to the first seminar in Southampton's Faculty of Arts and Humanities Advanced Seminar Series 2020. This seminar series is on pregnancy, birth and motherhood. We aim to bring researchers working on relevant topics across and beyond the arts and humanities into conversation with each other and with you, the audience. This first seminar focuses on pregnancy. In our panel, we have Nisreen Alwan, who works in public health, whose research covers health and well-being in pregnancy and interconception. We have Clare Hanson from English, talking about her research in epigenetics, maternal chimeras, and co-development. And we have Alexander Julin Mortensen from philosophy, who will discuss his work on the metaphysics of pregnancy. Finally, we have Jonat Nitsan-Green from art, whose work explores understanding maternal subjectivity through art. We'll begin with a panel discussion. This will last until around 11:05, and then we will then have a break of slightly under 5 minutes. We're going to return at about 11:10 for a question and answer session. During the question and answer session, we invite you to send questions or comments for the speakers to respond to. You can submit questions and comments through the chat functions on YouTube or Facebook. And if you're unable to comment in this way, you can send questions using the Contact Us form on the Southampton Human Worlds website. I'm going to begin by asking each of our speakers to tell us a little bit about themselves and their research on pregnancy. I'd like to begin with Nisreen.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Nisreen Alwan, so I'm an Associate Professor in Public Health at the University of Southampton and an Honorary Consultant in Public Health at University Hospital Southampton. I trained in medicine and in public health, and then my research area is really epidemiology. I did my PhD in the area of nutritional epidemiology, looking at maternal nutrition and pregnancy, in particular micronutrients, focusing on iron in pregnancy and how that is linked to long-term health outcomes in the children. So in the area of developmental origins of health and disease, which we'll talk about. And then my more recent research really is the same area, looking at pregnancy, looking at the period between successive pregnancies and preconception, and the factors shaping health and well-being for mothers and how they're linked to health and risk of disease in the children, but doing it in a maybe even more applied fashion, looking at data from routine healthcare sources. So really trying to apply the developmental origins of health and disease concept in our everyday life and practice. So that's me in a very, very short brief. So I'll pass over to Alexander to introduce himself.
Thanks a lot. So my name is Alexander, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Southampton. I took my master's at Aarhus University in philosophy as well. And the primary objection of my PhD research project is that theoretical analysis and explanations of pregnancy may be distorted by some of the assumptions underpinning the given theory. More specifically, I critically consider in my work how a dichotomy between self and other, whether it seems implicitly assumed or is more explicitly embraced, can distort scientific and philosophical theories of pregnancy. So, generally put, we may understand a dichotomy between self and other as a structural feature of theory, according to which we either ought to categorize something as part of the self or other to it. Thus, something cannot both count partly as self and other without resulting in theoretical ambiguity. For example, this ambiguity is characteristic of much phenomenological analysis of pregnancy, which states that the fetus is both other to and part of the self of the pregnant woman. Pregnancy, it is argued, blurs the boundaries between self and other. And likewise, in a very different context, immunological theory was once struggling to make sense of why the fetus wasn't expelled by the immune system of the pregnant woman, given that it should be characterized as foreign or other to the immunological self. And this phenomenon resulted in what's been named the paradox of pregnancy within the discipline of immunology. So, Despite the many features which distinguishes these disciplines from each other, they do exhibit a common issue. In both cases, it is, or at least once was in the case of immunology, assumed that we ought to categorize the fetus in the pregnant woman as either purely or self to the self of the pregnant mother of the pregnant woman. To be fair, some phenomenologists do obviously depart from this view when they state that the fetus is both part of and other to the self of the pregnant woman. But my argument is that this seemingly ambiguous conclusion seems nonetheless haunted by the structural logic of a self-other dichotomy. So for this reason, my objection is that it is this theoretical assumption which either results in ambiguity in one case, or what was once assumed as simply paradoxical in another. So in other words, it isn't pregnancy in itself, which I believe generates this theoretical ambiguity or paradoxicality. Rather, I argue that we ought to look at the theoretical approaches themselves as what may trigger these ambiguous verdicts when applied to the case of pregnancy. And for this purpose, I, to some extent at least, rely upon feminist epistemological theory about science in order to critically consider what way biases can influence theorists to embrace such dichotomous features. These considerations further lead me to questions such as, how can we theoretically construe the concept of the self in a non-dichotomous way? What empirical findings would license such a reconception? And lastly, how would phenomenological and metaphysical research on pregnancy fit with, if not necessarily benefit from, a more detailed reconception of the concept of the self? And that's a brief summary of my research project, and now I'd like to pass it on to Fiona to present her work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm a mother and a research artist who experienced 2 pregnancies and 2 births about 28 and 26 years ago. Today, I re-engage in questions of maternal subjectivity through a second practice-led fine art PhD research at Loughborough University. I had completed another PhD at Winchester School of Art, Southampton University in 2010. The first research focused on Israeli kibbutz childhood trauma and the maternal subjectivity. This new research examines my maternal experience, distinguished from childhood trauma, but not completely separated. The research question is how might drawing, understood as part of a maternal body and subjectivity's ecosystem, reveal the renewed maternal subjectivity cognition, and how might this renewed cognition affect, inform, open up, and refine drawing possibilities. I used 2 drawing methods, 1 watercolor on paper and 2 performative graphite drawings. In addition, I developed a method called Archive as Performative Lab. In this conversation, I will talk about the performative drawing in its potential relation to pregnancy. And I'll quickly show 3 slides at this point. Yeah, so this is the just collection of artworks and documentation from before pregnancy and during the pregnancies, and I'm now researching from a perspective of nearly 30 years ago, so that's quite important. This is just an example of the watercolor drawing, Erased Maternal Subjectivity, 850 to 852, 25th of May 2020. That's the whole title. So this is watercolor on paper. And this is the drawing that I'm going to focus on today. So it's the graphite performative drawing. And I will say more later. And so, yeah. So now I would like to pass it to Claire, but I don't know what happened. So I'm passing to Fiona. Thank you.
Clara, are you there? Okay. I think. Okay, so we've lost Claire momentarily. So I will just move on. Nisreen, you work on the developmental origins of health and disease. Can you explain a little bit more about what this concept means?
Sure, Fiona. So this is really a big area of research now in health epidemiology, and multidisciplinary, really. And it basically means that risk of ill health or disease and the state of health in late childhood and in adulthood could be shaped by environmental factors very early on in childhood or during pregnancy or even before pregnancy, so in the preconception period. So basically it's kind of good news in a way, because it's saying it's not everything is determined by genetics, so we can't do anything about it in terms of the risk of health and disease. And when I say disease, I mean the research in this area really spans a lot of outcomes, but it mainly it looked extensively at things like cardiovascular disease, like type 2 diabetes, like obesity, but also cancer, osteoporosis, function of the immune system. So a wide range of outcome in adulthood. So as I said, it's good news in a way that we're saying, a lot of these things are not predetermined by genetics. From a public health point of view, it's good news because say we can do something about it very, very early on. And the way this kind of in a very simplified manner work is through something, one mechanism is called epigenetics, where basically there's some sort of it's like think of it as the DNA sequence in our body is like a light switch. So you can switch it on and switch it off. That's kind of the process of epigenetics through things like DNA methylation and also histone modification. So basically, these are just mechanisms that occur to the gene that can switch off the light on and off, and it would then influence the expression and the activity of how the gene works and how it's translated in our phenotype. So, what happens in our body and health and disease. And this could be the evidence that we have now is that what happens during these critical, what we call maybe critical time points or period, which is pregnancy, before pregnancy, or early life, can actually operate that switch. And actually, these effects are quite strong because they could last multiple generations. So they're not very short-lived. So that's really that's what the discipline looks at, is what are these exposures? What are these environmental exposures? What is that can operate at these critical time points? That can maybe program the risk of disease, and how can we, obviously from a public health point of view, what can we do to try and optimize these periods so we can have less disease and ill health later in life.
Thank you so much, Nisreen. We now have Claire back, so I'm very happy to introduce Clare Hanson, reintroduce Clare Hanson. Ask Claire to tell us a little bit about her work. Okay, we seem to be having some technical difficulties with Claire. So let's just continue with Nisreen. So I find your work really interesting and challenging, I suppose, from my own point of view as a philosopher. I work on the way in which there can be pressure and very much very high standards applied to women, and women can have a lot of responsibility put on them in terms of the responsibility to kind of produce a perfect fetus. So I was just wondering, how do you deal with that, with this danger of science perhaps reinforcing blaming and shaming of pregnant women in relation to the health of their children?
Absolutely, Fiona. I completely share these concerns. And when I started my PhD research, obviously this area of research fascinated me. But very quickly I came to that conclusion, is that actually we need to be very careful with the messaging and how we communicate science and the actions based on the findings, because that is a lot of the time is translated into some form of extra pressure on mothers specifically, although the area of research also covers, exposures in fathers as well, but that's what less well researched than mothers. And you can see these in news headlines all the time. For example, there was a study a few months ago, maybe a year ago, that looked at maternal employment and linked it to childhood obesity, and how mothers who were working full time, their children might be more likely to be obese, in primary school. And we know very well in epidemiology, and also that everybody, even whoever publishes in that field really would have a whole list of limitations of how you interpret causality. What causes what, and what sort of what we call confounding factors, what could influence these results, and how we can account for them. But actually, these findings get taken out of context and really reported in a very blaming and shaming way of mothers. And we'd be interested also to link in later with what Alexander also thinks from a feminist point of view, in terms of the message being, well, if you're working full time, then you're doing harm to your child in terms of predisposing them to obesity. So I think the other thing to really point out very quickly is that a lot of the usual suspects in terms of, if you like, the exposures that may predispose to this adverse programming, things like obesity, smoking, and diet, obviously, are really very, very heavily shaped, if not entirely shaped, by wider social, economic and environmental factors. So actually then place the responsibility solely on choice and behavior, then that's really that's a wrong approach, and I think we in public health are constantly fighting against that, while trying to interpret this area of research.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm getting reverb. I completely agree with what you're saying about the way that things are presented. I remember seeing a headline recently, and it was about a study which had looked at the potential effects of air pollution on developing fetus, and the headline was, "Should pregnant women protect their children, their unborn children, against air pollution?" That's not the kind of the focus I would take from that kind of research. Jonat, Alexander, did either of you want to come in now and share your perspective on what Nisreen has been saying?
Yeah, I'd like to at least. I think it sounds extremely interesting, and I just wonder if you could comment a bit further on to what extent that you find it, or that you may find it troublesome, this amount or the extent of autonomy that's ascribed, or that can be ascribed to women in terms of all the impacts that they can have on the fetus, and the amount of external impacts that also influences them and their amount of choices that they have. Do we have this? Would you say that we may, in a lot of these discourses that ascribes and responsibility to pregnant women for their fetuses, an incorrect idea about the extent to which they are autonomous in the choices that they make in terms of their pregnancy and their health during pregnancy?
Yeah, Alexandra, absolutely. I think very fascinating also to have this conversation, because actually we don't regularly or usually have these conversations looking at the concept of self that you referred to, and autonomy. I think there's something also that is great to bring in, and that's, you know, people here, you know, others can say something about, is really the what happens in everyday practice, maybe in healthcare, that people, you know, including, you know, healthcare professionals, but also the wider context, you know, the family, that there is this focus on the baby or on the child as a priority, and there is this notion of that sacrifice from the mother side is good, because, you know, whatever sacrifice in order to optimize the health of the child, and sometimes these things are you know, implicitly underlie some of the discussions that happen in kind of in interactions, you know, in health and social care, and also in public health messaging. And I think what's missing and needs to be focused on more in the narrative that, you know, that we you know, we have as, you know, health professionals, public health professionals, is actually the focus of actually, if you're well as a mum, if you focus on your health and well-being, whether that's, you know, during pregnancy or, you know, after you have the child, then that would reflect on the health of your children and the health of your family. So looking at the family really as a unit probably needs to become more prominent than focusing on the individual, you know, each individual child. And that actually even includes siblings, you know, within each family. So every kind of child is treated as an entity, as a kind of a separate entity. But actually, there is this family unit, and maybe we certainly in the research that I do, trying to focus on more of the health and the well-being of that family unit, which includes everybody in it, including the mother. So yes.
Right. Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you so much, Nisreen and Alexander. So I'm hoping that Claire is back now and is able to introduce herself. Claire? Oh, sorry, no, not quite ready for Claire. So Yona, you have a question or a comment for Nisreen?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just interested when you said that you are dealing with the question how you interpret causality. So this is really something that interests me very much, and this is such a rare opportunity that we are talking, that we are here with science and health, and it's not just art or just culture. So yeah, that really interests me.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what we deal with mostly in our research, is how you, it's that question of, is it association or causation? Is it correlation versus causation? You see all things linked together. We know from the research that, you know, my group did and others do, that things like maternal employment, you know, educational attainment, whether you're a lone parent, the level of deprivation in the area that you live in is very, very closely linked to the kind of the behavioral risk factors, such as, you know, obesity, diet, physical activity, and smoking. And when you're trying to establish causality of what causes what in terms of the, you know, outcomes, the health outcomes, this is not a straightforward thing. There are obviously loads of thinking that goes into this in terms of looking at, you know, the causal modeling. You know, how do you optimize your model to account for this, all of this confounding? Some of the study designs that we think are better at accounting for confounding, things like what we call randomized control trials, where you try and create like a counterfactual reality. So, you know, if you have any sort of intervention or an exposure, so, you know, you randomize to one group as opposed to other. Many of what we look at in the developmental alternate disease is really, it can't be tested in a randomized control trial. It's not a simple tablet or you know, medicine that you give to people. So what we try and do in what we call observational epidemiology is try and get to that state of control, as much as we can, control of confounding. And the main limitation of that is that there are still confounders which we don't know, let alone, so there's confounders that we don't measure because we can't control for things that we don't measure, but also there are confounders that we don't know. You know, the science is just not there yet to explain some of these links. So that makes it very hard and almost impossible to control for them. So there's always the caveat, and there's always a limitation of findings like that. And the challenge for us really in science communication is to try and communicate these caveats and be very careful in the way these findings are translated. Sometimes this is very difficult, as we I've just mentioned, in terms of the media taking some headlines from papers and presenting them as facts.
Yeah. Thank you.
So now I'm going to ask Jonat. So Jonat, you argue that drawing enables thinking about pregnancy. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means and how it works?
Yeah. Okay. So pregnancy is a life-changing phenomena. In the experience of pregnancy, I transforms to we, awareness to one's inner space is enhanced. I turns into a place for another unknown human. My body becomes a place. Another time is happening beside and inside my time and the normal time. So in short, it seems that every concept demands reconsideration. So since this is such a complicated issue, pregnancy, there is a need to open a thinking space as wide as possible. So this is where I'd like to say that the key point here is that artists think with materials, and I'll talk about the graphite drawing as I will as I carry on. So just bear with me. Okay. The intention with this graphite drawing was to explore concepts that emerged from my maternal experience, such as flexibility and collaboration, by creating an elastic performative drawing. So the drawing is made from graphite powder mixed with latex and thread and inks, silver ink, and chalk and I spread it with a knife, with a palette knife, on a foam surface, and I build layers after layers. So it's a process that takes time. And when it is completed, I can actually peel it off the surface. And that's the texture. That's what it looks like from close up. So yeah, these are images of pregnant soldier and toy soldier that I actually drew on the foam surface, and they transferred into the graphite drawing, but also the traces remained on the foam surface, and this is quite important for later on. And then this drawing was performed with another performer who went through treatment, fertility treatment, and unfortunately it didn't work. But we actually performed it, and it's this engagement with material that I'm interested. So in the performance, we used contact improvisation, holding the drawing, turning, twisting, pulling and stretching it as we rolled on the floor, pushed against the walls, and moved in the space. This was a non-verbal dialogue. The dance was built on a mutuality and improvisation where we listened attentively to each other, to the drawing and the space, which is a shipping container. The drawing has an audio quality produced by shaking and tearing. And basically, I'm thinking about the general question, which is what are the problematic situations for a pregnant woman, and two specific questions: what might it be like beyond being beyond the limits or borders of myself? And the second question: how could I make sense of the experience of pregnancy, where words as concepts are turned upside down and inside out? So I'll do a stop sharing. So this is just a taste of, I just wanted to give a taste at this stage of how I think with materials, and maybe hopefully later I can go deeper into, but this is just a rough sketch.
I love this idea of being beyond the borders of yourself. It links in so much with my own work, which looks at how the differences, the relationship between the pregnant women and the fetus kind of challenges our ethical concepts, which I think rely on firm borders. I think Alexander also had a question or a comment.
Yeah, again, sounds really interesting. Jonathan, I was wondering if you could elaborate on what concept that you would say in particular needs some kind of revision in light of pregnancy.
Need some kind of what? Can you please say
revision?
Revision.
As far as I understand, you think that there's a lot of concepts that we would have to reconsider.
Yes, yeah,
return to pregnancy.
Yeah.
Is there anyone in particular that you think we have to critically reconsider in light of these considerations of your own research?
Well, I think again, it's such a monumental event, pregnancy. So and then you realize everything is connected to everything else, and it's a matter of relationship between the parts. So I think that's so I'm reading new materialism. It's a really helpful theories that I find there. So I'm like, when I prepared for this talk, I was thinking about vibrations, for example, because if I think about what it is to be beyond myself, and the drawing that I've made is not the conventional drawing, which is a pencil on paper, and you cannot split them up. So there is so the issue of separation and continuity, and to be beyond myself in terms of materiality, of how we are sensing. So you're thinking with material, you're thinking with the senses, with feelings. Exactly what Nisreen also said, with things that you can't measure. So it's very difficult to isolate just one concept. But yes, there are. But the drawing helps to focus and to kind of help to stay to pave a way, rather than to get lost in and to be overwhelmed with so many problems.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting discussion. Alexander, could you tell us a little bit? So I think one thing that your work and Jonat's work have in common is that you both think that thinking about pregnancy kind of challenges our concepts. So, and you focus particularly on the concept of the self. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the self plays a role in your work?
Yeah, I think it plays a role in my work to the extent that, well, there's a lot of metaphysics of pregnancy which is primarily concerned with the question of when does two organisms become two, or when does two bodies become two, and these are really interesting questions. But parallel to these kind of considerations in the discipline of metaphysics, we also have this seemingly blossoming field within phenomenology about phenomenology of pregnancy. And these kind of analysis often question the status of the self and what's the relation between the self of the pregnant woman and the fetus, which is assumably also a self, I'd like to believe, during pregnancy, even though it's within the same bodily boundaries of the pregnant woman. So to put it briefly, I said that the self plays a central role in my work in the sense that I'm really interested in figuring out whether there are some similar questions that needs to be answered, just like there has been in the metaphysical pregnancy about the status of when does one organism becomes two, for example, about the case of when does oneself becomes two, or what does the case of pregnancy tells us about which commitments we should have in ontology and ontology's underlying phenomenologies of pregnancy about how to individuate between selves, such as whether we should individuate between selves in terms of biological criteria or some other kind of psychological mental criteria, and whether any of these aspects would offer a solution to what I would argue is a flaw in much of the phenomenological theories about pregnancy, which seems to stop at these kind of ambiguous verdicts about pregnancy, merely stating something like pregnancy blurs the boundaries between self and other, etc., 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 and the self is leaky and stuff like that, which I don't really think says that much. And of course, it's an over-exaggeration to present these accounts like this, but I think there's a lot of constructive work to do in order to decipher what kind of entity the self is taken to be in phenomenologies of pregnancy. And if we have a more detailed concept about that, I think we can also return with these insights to discourses or theories like metaphysics of pregnancy and consider what we would want to say about how these relate during pregnancy and by the end of pregnancy.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I'm afraid it's time for us to stop now for our break. We'll be back in just under 5 minutes. Thank you very much to all our speakers, and we will see you on the other side.
Thank you.
Hello, welcome back to the University of Southampton Faculty of Arts and Humanities Advanced Seminar Series 2020. This is our first seminar on pregnancy. And before the break, we had a few technical difficulties with Clare Hanson, but I'm pleased to say that she is back with us. So Clare, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Fiona, thank you. And thanks all for your patience. I've swapped laptops and I've swapped rooms and now the doorbell's ringing. Excellent. Thanks, Fiona, again. My research, well, I've worked on pregnancy for a long time, intermittently, and it's bound up with the work I've done on eugenics and the work I've done on genetics and the literary imagination. And what I was thinking about for this particular webinar was thinking about the porosity or the permeability of the pregnant body. And it ties really to three topics that I can kind of briefly explain now. And one of them is epigenetics, which many of you will be very familiar with. Still a contested field, but it seems that there is very good evidence that via epigenetic mechanisms, the external environment of pregnancy can modify gene expression in the fetus mediated by the mother's body, so that you get this sense that what's outside can actually affect what's happening inside, and that these modifications of gene expression can have lasting effects in the lives of the child, and that some of these effects can be inherited. That's the kind of really contested part. So that interests me, the idea that, again, the maternal body is permeable in that sense. And I mean their maternal body, the pregnant body, is permeable. The other thing I kind of thought was quite interesting was this idea of maternal chimeras or fetal maternal chimeras, which again, you may be familiar with, the idea that cells from the fetus migrate into the maternal body, where they can linger for decades. The process happens the other way around as well, but it's much more common fetus to mother. So you've got, again, this kind of complicated kind of porosity of the body. And the speculation is that these fetal chimeras are a way whereby the fetus can manipulate the maternal body for its own ends. So, for example, the cells might migrate to areas near the breast or in the brain that control breastfeeding and stimulate increased milk production, which would be excellent for the fetus, but not necessarily so great for the mother further down the line. So it's very clear that, as so often, there is this dialectic between ideas or readings of pregnancy in terms of either harmonious symbiosis or competition. Very familiar ideas. But the thing that really interested me, because I'm working on multi-species worlds at the moment, is the finding that the maternal microbes, maternal symbionts, are kind of critical to development. An idea that's been very much pioneered by Scott Gilbert, the developmental biologist, who's written a wonderful book, We've Never Been Individuals, article, We've Never Been Individuals. And we're all fairly familiar with the idea that when the waters break in pregnancy, maternal microbes kind of rush into the fetal gut and, again, modify gene expression to prepare the gut for its external environment, the likely external environment. But it also turns out that maternal microbes are in play in pregnancy very early on, much earlier on than had been thought. I found this quite fascinating because it makes you think that could you therefore think of pregnancy as a multi-species experience, that what are involved, if the human organism is a multi-species relation, as Anna Singh says, then pregnancy too could be construed as a multi-species relation with very, very, very diverse patterns of microbes within the mother, which obviously non-human, the mother, and then the fetus with movement across all those kind of permeable boundaries. And this in turn made me think about the part and whole model and the whole question of whether you think about pregnancy in terms of the fetus being part of the whole, because I think if you think about the maternal body as an ecosystem rather than a static entity, as a dynamic ecosystem, then you've got which is open-ended. You've got a very different kind of view of that phenomenon, which becomes, in a way, no longer something that is whole. So the concept of the whole can be deconstructed. That's kind of, those are my thoughts. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry about the laptop, the doorbell.
Don't worry. Thank you so much, Claire. I think it's so interesting how your work kind of bridges, or sort of almost connects the work that we were discussing earlier. So Nisreen works on epigenetics, and Yonat was talking about how motherhood breaches your boundaries. And you connected those two things, seeing epigenetics as another way of the maternal body being porous. So I hope that we can get some conversation between all four of you in this second section. So perhaps we can bring everybody back now for the Q&A. We've already got one question. So this is from Marie, who is an MSc philosopher from Denmark, a trained midwife, and the mother of 4 children. She says she's interested in the lack of distinction between the autonomy of the mother and the fetus, which she says also goes for the newborn child, far into childhood, and as well for the family unit as a whole. She says that in the NICE guidelines and other European guidance, we don't seem to make the distinction between the needs of the mother and the newborn clear. So I'm not sure if that's a question to anybody in particular, but there's quite a lot to kind of think about there. Would anybody like to come in on that, on the the failure to distinguish between the autonomy of the mother and the fetus, the needs of the mother and the needs of the fetus.
I mean, I can comment that, Fiona, just to say, because obviously we need, I think in health, that's why this, platforms like this and interaction like this is so helpful. I don't think we have enough input, multidisciplinary input from the disciplines represented here, for example, in terms of how not only how we communicate the science, but actually how we think of the science and how we formulate our questions. And I think that's probably really essential now at this stage, to bring in these perspectives at the very early stage of designing research or designing service delivery, so health service delivery, and how these interactions take place and how we communicate risk, which is the big thing, obviously, in health. You know, it's about communicating risk and how to minimize it. And I think all multidisciplinary conversations, so that the disciplines in health, health research, and science in general understand these concepts, that we can probably get there. But I generally just agree with the comment. I mean, I don't know. I think for me, really, it is the distinction. You need to have the distinctions between the needs of the mother and the newborn, but also I think we also need to recognize that, again, that the concept of sacrifice, although not explicitly communicated, is always there. It's implicit in that, you know, the mother has to do all the mother can to maximize the health of children, even if that involves you know, sacrifice in terms of her own perhaps mental well-being, you know, other aspects of well-being. And we the first step is to try to explicitly talk about that in our discipline.
Thank you very much, Nisreen. Does anybody else want to comment on this? I mean, one thing I've noticed myself is that you tend to see either a kind of assumption that the mother and the fetus have identical interests, or almost the opposite, where you see them as put as kind of in conflict, and as the fetus needing to be protected from the mother. And so I think it's really necessary to go beyond those kind of two extremes, and to think of the mother and the fetus as having different but related interests, and as mothers as balancing the needs of their whole families and themselves, and as something that's work that mothers do.
I'd also like to jump in.
Yes, please do.
So I certainly don't have an answer to this question, but I'm really haunted by it myself. So Marie asks by the end of her comment if we can perceive pregnancy as work. And this is not an issue that's central to my theory at all, but I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of it in social reproduction theory, for example, and feminist theory. And I just think it's really striking how much of a topic this has become also outside of like academia and very academic feminist theories as well. So for example, also Marie notes the fact that Olga Ravn has just published a book, Mit Arbejde, or My Work, as it translated in English. And there seems to be like a lot of going on also in like literary context, both internationally and in Denmark in particular as well. So for example, it's not her most recent book, but very popular authors like Rachel Cusk has written a lot about it. For example, A Life's Work, and I know that Clare is also very familiar with her biography as well and has written on it. And in addition to like authors like Olga Ravn, we also have like Cecilie Lind in contemporary literature in Denmark who writes about this topic, and major literary figures like Beatrice Mørk, who's also written about these aspects of the political dimension of reproduction. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's not as much like myself thinking out loud as an what I'm saying is that it's not so much an answer to a question but I just think it's a really interesting consideration that it seems there's a lot of focus, even outside of academia, upon how we are supposed, or how we are arguably taking reproduction as granted in the role that it plays in the maintenance of society as a whole. And that sort of like puts pressure on an explicit discussion about whether we should conceive reproduction and child caring or childbearing as work, and why not, and what these kind of questions mean to like very latent issues about social injustice to women.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Alexander. So we have a comment and a question from Anita. So Anita points out that the tendency to shame pregnant women has been there for a long time, saying that before 1750, when pregnancy was the woman's realm, pregnant women were assumed to be able to influence their baby's health by their imagination. So that's does anybody want to respond to that comment? Claire, your mic is muted.
Keep showing. I don't understand why. Sorry, can I jump in on that? I think it's really interesting because the whole idea goes back to the Greeks. It's incredibly important. This whole idea of maternal impressions, it goes down, becomes very important in the 18th century literature. And in many, many ways, it's a kind of earlier instantiation, a folk instantiation of epigenetics. That's the kind of interesting thing about it for me. It's something where you've got these kind of ways of attempting to deal with the idea of how does a pregnancy, what is the outcome, the fear, the uncertainty, and initially it's imagined in terms of these external environmental kind of factors, and the research is now unpicking that kind of impact at the kind of molecular level. And again, that kind of, I think for me, highlights one of the things that relates to the question and to all the discussion so far, which is how we negotiate between cultural, experiential perceptions of pregnancy and the increasingly molecular understanding of pregnancy in biomedicine. And then, of course, the question of the translation of how we actually care, how we provide health services and care. All these things are jostling uneasily, I think, together. Shut up.
Thank you very much, Claire. Anita also had a question for Yonat, asking, could you tell us more about the background for the creation of pregnant soldiers for your artwork?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's good. So this is connecting directly with maternal subjectivity and with my own biographical, historical, cultural background, because I'm coming from Israel. I was born in Israel and I moved to the UK 30 years ago. So this still with me, and I'm, even though geographically I'm in a different location, but some things are always stays with one. So I've been working with the toy soldier as a way to maybe understand or say something about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then I felt that whatever I produce has a maternal sensibility in it, but it's stays suppressed, it is unsaid. So I was using, like I did a performative drawing in the center of Milton Keynes, and I purposefully left it all wet. I worked with the element of wetness, but then I realized that these maternal elements, what I call, are not articulated enough. So except me, nobody actually can spot it. And that's what brought me to do a second PhD now, and to really try to be more specific with this aesthetic. I'm very careful not to say maternal aesthetic, although I do say it, but I'm careful from this phrase as well at the same time. So yeah, so it's entanglement of my personal and with history and with culture and with biology and with material. Yeah, it's all there.
Thank you very much, Jonat. We now have another question for Clare. This is from Holly, who says, Clare, your previous work is on eugenics and genetics in the literal imagination. Have you found any examples of pregnancy as a microspecies relation in literature?
Microspecies relation in literature. Huh. Very good question. I think that the place where this happens is overwhelmingly, sorry, I was just scrolling through my memory bank here, but I think it's overwhelmingly in science fiction. And most recently, I was reading the amazing Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. I don't know whether anybody knows that, but it is just stunning. And in my view, it's a kind of whole mapping of biological development in all its kind of manifold, exotic, terrifying and uncanny kind of modes. So if it's there in science fiction, and I certainly think in Vandermeer's work, which is amazing.
So that's going to go on everybody's reading list then. Thank you so much. So we only have a short time left, and I don't think we have any questions in the queue. So I thought we could just finish by asking each of you just very briefly to give your final thoughts. The thing that you would like to just finish by sharing with the audience on the topic of pregnancy. I'm going to do it in alphabetical order, so I'm going to start with Alexander.
What I would like in particular to share about my thoughts on pregnancy. Well, I think that pregnancy suggests that we both have to revise a lot of concepts, as Jonat also was pointing towards. In particular, our concepts are common stance concepts about the body. So, for example, and the embody itself, if we operate with such a notion. Also, Clare Hanson was into this aspect about the permeability of bodies. I think it's a really interesting question. Yet I also think that the body, for example, is permeable in so many ways. So, for example, we can see that it's permeable when we have to go to the loo, and at this very moment I'm sweating a bit, and in that sense it's also very permeable in a very mundane sense. But there's something significant, extraordinary about the way that the body is permeable during pregnancy that makes it stand out to these even more mundane scenarios, one would say. I think it would be nice to reconsider it more thoroughly what exactly this difference really relies in, because surely the distinction between our embodied beings and the rest of the world is permeable in many, many banal ways, but there's something interesting in particular about how it is in pregnancy that I think really justifies the huge amount of research that is done upon this topic across disciplines at the moment.
Thank you, Alexander. So as I said, alphabetical order. So next is Clare. So do you want to share us your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I echo everything that Alexander has said, and I think one of the things it also raises, one of the questions that pregnancy and thinking about pregnancy also raises, and of course it's germane to this idea of permeability of the body, is of course about why do we assign, it relates to the mother-fetus relation, obviously, why do we just assign individuality and consciousness to the organizing intelligence that moves the body around? Are there further questions about what consciousness might be or how it might work that could be explored more from this kind of perspective, if you like, of biological interdependence, biological organistic relations? Yeah, I think that's what I'd add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Nisreen, would you like to share a final thought, a final message? Nisreen, you're on mute.
Sorry. I suppose the final message is just to say, really, we in science, and particularly in the field of public health, are struggling. We struggle with the balance, really, between that false narrative, the narrative choice, in terms of what determines health and behaviors. I mean, we aren't just trying to bring an example very close to memory, the debate, yesterday, the Parliament vote around food vouchers for school during the school holiday for children who live in poverty. We know, a big proportion of children live in poverty, particularly now in a pandemic situation. So now it's really inappropriate to go and say, well, this is a choice for the families to provide healthy diet for their children to prevent things such as, for example, obesity. So we're very much aware of this very, very strong economic and kind of the bigger environment influence and choice. But at the same time, we don't want to take agency away and say, oh, this is all predetermined, things are bad, so you can't do anything about your health or the health of your family, as a mother. And really, my final message is help, seeking help from the arts and humanities in trying to make the narrative a bit more sophisticated and more realistic in that sense. So balancing these two things, having the agency and feeling the power to improve things as a mother in a family for the children, but also really acknowledging these wider forces and by that avoiding blaming and shaming of women.
That is just such a great question. I wish we had another 2 hours a day to talk about it. Yonat, did you want to give your final thoughts or reflections or message?
Yeah, just very simple that I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I think that there is definitely a need for a regular this kind of format, not digital format, I mean, but this kind of coming together of the cross-disciplinary and really look at this question of pregnancy with all from all perspectives. So the really wide social issues, as well as the small material engagement from biology and then art and poetic thinking and everything to be as inclusive as possible in engaging with this problem of pregnancy. I think that's what I'm taking from this from this event today. Yeah, thank you very much. It's very enriching, and I'm really excited.
Thank you so much, Yona. I think I have very much enjoyed hearing the four of you speak to each other, and I think you're right, we do need more of this. So I would like to say thank you very much to all the speakers, and to remind the audience that this is the first of our seminar series. We have 3 seminars in total, and our next seminar will be on motherhood, and you can see that's on Tuesday the 17th of November at 2 p.m. UK time. So I do hope that you can join us then. Thank you very much, and goodbye.